So what are these 7 contingent factors, or loose cannons as he refers to them, that have the potential to cause a rapidly escalating and destructive expansion of the killing of innocent people on his view? Well, the first thing that he points to is what he calls the psychological vulnerability of old and seriously ill people. And the idea here is that as people get older, particularly very old and very ill, that their ability to take in information and to take all the facts into account and making decisions, it gets degraded. And their ability to sort of resist the influence of people who are pressuring them is also degraded. And there's some evidence that this really happens out there. There's lots of stories and statistics about retired people who are swindled out of their money by con artists and manipulated by people who are acting as their nurses or their housekeepers and so on. So this isn't utterly without any plausibility. The question that we always want to look at when we look at these loose cannons is, A, how prevalent do we think they are? B, how likely do we think they are to be specifically manifesting as a mechanism for allowing this destructive expansion of the killing of innocents? And finally, C, are there mechanisms, are there ways in which the potential harms that these factors might bring about, given assisted suicide, can be mitigated or limited or prevented? And so in the cases of psychological vulnerability, right, a lot of this will depend upon the individuals that surround them, the ways in which the decisions are made. And so it's kind of unclear both how much influence that would have and how it might be mitigated. One thing to note is that merely being psychologically vulnerable or subject to increased susceptibility to pressure, that in and of itself isn't necessarily going to manifest itself as an increase in the people who opt for assisted suicide, who, were they not psychologically vulnerable, wouldn't. And so the connection between assisted suicide and psychological vulnerability is really pretty speculative. It's not something that we can just dismiss out of hand, but the impact it would have is not clear. The next thing that he points to is what he calls healthcare cost management. And the idea here is that society has a limited amount of resources, finite healthcare resources, and so in all societies you find there is pressure to manage healthcare costs, pressure to spend only a certain amount of resources, spend it in a way that society feels is the most productive, and so on. And here doerflinger suggests that these kinds of pressures will lead to limiting life-extending treatments for the terminally ill, or maybe will lead to healthcare management groups pressuring or unduly proffering assisted suicide as an option for treatment with the terminally ill in order to save money. Now, this again is a phenomenon that definitely occurs, but the specific way that he talks about it, this idea that it'll lead to the limiting of life-extending treatments to the terminally ill, that's not something that's really intrinsically tied to whether or not there's an assisted suicide option. Healthcare cost management exerts these kinds of pressures, and so there is a pressure to limit life-extending treatments to the terminally ill, regardless of whether or not there's an assisted suicide option. And it's not clear would be the most cost efficient for these people, and so it's not clear how those pressures would manifest themselves if we had some sort of limited assisted suicide option. The next factor that he points to is the mechanism of legal guardianship. So in the United States, for example, if someone is declared adjudicated to be mentally unfit, that is, they're not coherent, rational enough to make decisions for themselves, or they are so ill that they're not in a position to make decisions for themselves, the court will appoint a legal guardian. Oftentimes, it'll be a family member. Oftentimes, it'll be someone who's been designated by the person prior to this problem in a living will, for instance. But people who don't have family members, people who have unscrupulous family members, could potentially be victimized by this mechanism of legal guardianship. It's an essential mechanism. Again, it's not intrinsically related to the idea of a limited legal right of assisted suicide. It is a mechanism that we have now because there are individuals that need to have someone take up guardianship to make the decisions for them because they're not capable for one reason or another of doing it for themselves. This mechanism does have potential for abuse, and I've got a link in the syllabus to a discussion by John Oliver on Last Week Tonight about cases of abuse of legal guardianship for elderly and retired people. The next factor that doerflinger brings up is the notion that once we introduce this idea that people who are terminally ill have an option of assisted suicide, then they argues there'll naturally be this pressure to expand the notion of what counts as the terminal illness for the purposes of eligibility for assisted suicide. And as a result, the number of people who could be eligible for assisted suicide will expand and expand. And he gives an anecdotal story about some person who bragged that they had in fact expanded the notion of what counted as a terminal illness in their country. He gives a sort of apocryphal suggestion that diabetes could eventually become one of the terminal illnesses that gets included in this diagnosis. And it's certainly true that if there is a legislative or regulatory mechanism that allows for assisted suicide, that if that's tied to diagnoses of terminal illness, what counts as a terminal illness will be important for us to delimit. What's not clear is that there is an inevitable widening of the permissibility, the scope of the number of cases. This hasn't proven to be true, for instance, in the case of abortions. Right? So the Roe versus Wade decision wasn't pushed to include an ever-widening scope of cases where abortions were considered to be legal under federal law. And so it's not clear that this is always or inevitably going to happen. It's also not clear that there aren't mechanisms for trying to regulate or prevent abuses of that kind of expansion of the notion of what is a terminal illness. The next factor that doerflinger mentions is what he characterizes as a widespread and serious prejudice against the handicapped that he suggests might well lead to people pressuring them to opt for assisted suicide, people projecting onto them a life that's not worth living and trying to convince them that their life's not worth living, and also guardianship, potential abuses by people who look at this handicapped person over whom they have legal guardianship and suggest that their life isn't worth living. And There do exist prejudices against handicapped individuals. There is, I think, from a sort of average person's perspective, a sort of perception that someone who's a paraplegic has a really terrible life, a perception that isn't necessarily reflected in the life satisfaction assessments made by the paraplegic themselves. And so these things are real possibilities. They need to be carefully considered when we decide any sort of legislation that's going to impact people that are potentially the subject of these kinds of prejudices.